Welcome to the Homefront Podcast, hosted by me, Becca Bookman. The Homefront Podcast aims to introduce you to the people, initiatives, and ideas shaping Israel from within. Israel is facing a multi-front war, and the media has become its own complex battleground. The narratives that journalists provide us, they not only inform us, but they also shape our perception of reality. And when it comes to Israel, we have to ask, is the media actually reliable? On today's episode, I'm joined by Chaim Lax, editor and researcher at Honest Reporting. We'll be talking about the media during wartime and the organization's work to make sure that journalists and outlets remain honest. Welcome to the show, Chaim.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Chaim, how is your Zionism doing today?
It's doing pretty good. In Israel, we recently had the Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, and it's been like a nice extra jolt of Zionism, especially this year with October 7th and everything. It's reinvigorating maybe of the Zionist spirit.
If somebody clicks on this episode here now, what would they gain from this episode?
They'll gain an understanding of how to read the media with a critical eye when it comes to Israel, and understand that while the media plays an important role in society, when it comes to Israel, not everything that's presented in the media is necessarily 100% objective. With a good critical eye, you can separate the information from the bias that can be inherent in certain stories.
What is Honest Reporting?
Honest Reporting is a media monitoring organization. So what we do is we look at the international media, the English-speaking media, American media, British media. We look at the media, the print media, the broadcasting media, and because of the world we live in, also social media. And we see how journalists and news organizations are presenting stories from Israel and whether they're presenting them accurately, or they're skewing their stories, or there's a bias inherent in it that readers should know that what they're reading is not necessarily 100% objective. So that's what Honest Reporting does. It's a critical eye on the media.
What does it mean to keep the media honest? And what does an honest media look like?
I think an honest media is a transparent media, and a media that provides nuance to every story it gives. For example, if they're doing a story on Hamas, it's important not only to give how they frame the story, but who they're interviewing to give background information on the story. There are some academics who clearly have a bias against Israel, or don't want to say they're pro-Hamas, but they might be more sympathetic to Hamas. If the media is presenting them as just an objective scholar, then that's not being transparent. And like with most stories, there needs to be nuance. Not everything's black and white. And if they're presenting the story as black and white, then they're missing something out on the story.
And why is it important to have an honest media?
Well, I say for two reasons. There's an objective reason, not necessarily related to Israel, is that the media's role in society is to educate and inform the public. If the media is not educating, informing, quote-unquote objectively, they're not providing the whole story to the public, then they're failing in their duty. When it comes to Israel, the added necessity for an honest media is that because they frame the public outlook on Israel, and the public influences government, so there's this whole domino effect of, if the media is presenting Israel in negative light, and then the public is only getting their understanding of what's happening in Israel and Gaza from the media, and then the people are skewed one way now, and that affects because governments are elected and governments are the voice of the people, as I say. That affects how the government then treats its relationships with Israel, whether it's more critical of Israel or takes stands against Israel. So I see the media as being maybe one of the first dominoes in this huge domino effect that can have real world repercussions.
Very insightful. And I want to follow that up by asking you, everyday people, we want to get our news and we want to believe that the journalists and the outlets are being truthful and that we can rely on them. So why is it that the media wouldn't be honest with us, especially when it comes to Israel?
I think everyone has biases. I have a bias, you have a bias, everyone has a biases. And when it comes to Israel, some people may have stronger biases. So a person's personal bias, if I can say it that way, can influence how they report in Israel. Not necessarily even a journalist's bias. It could be an editorial room's bias on which stories they pick up, which stories they don't pick up, where they shine light, where they don't shine light. And so I think personal biases can affect why the media wouldn't necessarily be as objective when it comes to stories from Israel.
And do you think there's a reason why Israel in particular attracts such a range of biases?
I think if we're talking about journalists on the ground in Israel from foreign media outlets, some, let's say, at the most extreme, will be just biased against Israel for personal reasons. They appreciate an underdog. They like David and Goliath stories. And now that we're in the 76th year of Israel, Israel has become a stable regional force and a mini superpower within the region, that they don't see Israel as the underdog necessarily. I think it's also one of the major issues is that a lot of journalists who come to Israel, then they haven't studied Israel University, then they might not necessarily be well informed about Israel. But they come, let's say they work for a news outlet. They're told you're going to Israel to report from Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the Greater Middle East, let's say, for a few years. And they don't really have that much knowledge of it. So they come and there's like an echo chamber of journalists who are already here and they have their biases and they can pass it on to the next generation of foreign journalists in the country. So I don't necessarily think it's like they know they're biased, certain journalists, but it just, because of the information they're getting, it can then form a subconscious bias for them.
Something that I would love to understand greater is the journalists come here. They see it with their own eyes, and yet often that doesn't translate into their reporting. What's the disconnect?
That's a good question. I think there are two effects happening here. One is they're seeing, but the story that from Israel is not the only thing they're seeing. They don't go down to the south to go to Kibbutz Be'eri and then catch necessarily the plane home, never having seen anything else. So they're taking multiple stories into account when they're reporting. But again, if they have a personal bias, it's kind of like in general, a witness, a court case has a personal bias and might see things differently than something that a security camera could pick up. So if they have a personal bias, that even if they've seen something, they may think that there needs to be context added to it. They might think, like, let's say, take for example, they go down to the south where Hamas commits atrocities. They can report on those atrocities. But if they think there's some context needed to it that may be a little critical of how Israel has dealt with Gaza the past 15, 17 years, then they'll add that, which can already skew then the picture that they're going. We may not agree with how they present that context. That context might be flawed in a way because it doesn't take into account certain issues, which is then where honest reporting comes in and says, well, you provide this context, but that context isn't entirely full. That context is biased. So that's why I think you're seeing sometimes that they're seeing, but the reports aren't always necessarily the way you want it to be.
Now, it's important to recognize that not all journalists require the accountability and honesty because they hold themselves to those standards. But for journalists who don't, what goes into the work of critiquing the media?
First, I would like to say I agree with you. Not every journalist. Some people might think all the media is biased against Israel. I want to say that's not true. There is definitely a problem with media bias when it comes to Israel, but it's not 100% across the board. All foreign journalists have it. So what goes into critiquing is, if you read an article, you have to have a certain understanding of what's happening to really critique an article that has bias in it. If you have no understanding of Israel, you've never read anything about Israel, Gaza, the Arab-Israeli conflict, you're not going to be able to pick out the issues with how the report has been written, which is one of the problems that honest reporting is trying to rectify, is that the average person in America or England, whatever, does not have the background knowledge about a conflict thousands of miles away that includes a very small range of territory. They're not going to really have spent their life reading up on this stuff. And then all they're getting is from the media this context or this report that is skewed or with lacking nuance or biased. So you have to have a certain understanding. And then You read the article, and then you can pick out where you feel that the journalist went wrong. I would suggest that anyone who feels like an article is skewed, research the facts, the context, anything that's being presented in this article that you feel is off in some way. Thanks to Google, we have like encyclopedia or more at our fingertips. So that's like a good way of starting to look at the media with a critical eye, is just doing your research into it. But as I say that, it's also important to know where you're doing your research. If there's something you really like, some crazy statistic that makes no sense, if you look it up, it might be on some crazy website, so that just has no validity as a website. So I'd say look at strong sources that try to be impartial. Look at multiple sources, try to get the full story, and then you can see if you think that reporter is right or wrong.
What's so interesting about everything that you're mentioning is that I remember in high school, we actually had a media literacy mini unit that we did, specifically the girls, in terms of learning about how to look at the media and how it presents females. And I'm almost curious what your thoughts are on, should more people be educated on how to be more media literate?
Media literacy and looking at the information that you're being presented with a critical eye is a very important skill. I don't think a lot of people are developing correctly, especially among the younger generations. They're spending a lot of time on social media. They're being presented with a lot of information on TikTok, and if they don't have the skills to be able to decipher or to discern what is a legitimate idea versus what is an extreme idea versus what's an idea based in fact versus what's an idea that's just being presented so that you'll have a skewed ideology, it becomes very dangerous.
I want to make sure that in this conversation, we get back to talking about the media and the war. So during this war, where has media bias been most apparent?
I think my biggest concern with media bias during the war is, yes, there are these large reports that are sometimes put out that you're just like, from start to finish, there's an issue with the report. But my bigger concern is the subtle bias in media reports, that you could read an article and it doesn't necessarily come across as biased because there's a few terms thrown in, or that will color the reader or the viewer's impression of what's happening. And over time, that can build to a skewed perception of what's happening. For example, one of the most common terms we found going through media reports over the past 7 months is the term "could not be independently verified." The IDF says something, the media says this cannot be independently verified. But the issue becomes, if you're reading a report and in one paragraph it says the Gaza Ministry of Health says X, and in the next paragraph it says the IDF says Y, this could not be independently verified. Well, there's two issues with there. One is they're not being totally transparent as to who the Gaza Ministry of Health is. That's a Hamas-controlled ministry. And two, it puts a question mark on what the IDF has said, but it has not put a question mark over what this Gaza Ministry of Health has said. And so that's why my concern isn't with these large issues of bias, it's with subtle biases that can, once you've read these stories with these subtle biases for enough months, you get a skewed portrait of what's happening in Israel, and then it becomes that domino effect that the media has now skewed the public's perception of Israel, and that can have effect on how governments, as the voice of the people, then treat their relations with Israel.
I really appreciate that when you're thinking about why you're doing what you're doing, you're thinking about a larger picture that relates to society and government. So can you tell us a little bit more about when you see an article that doesn't line up, seems to have some bias, what's the next thing that honest reporting does?
It depends on the article. If the article, let's say you read it, it's a fairly nuanced article, it's a fairly decent article, there's just one thing in there that's skewed, that's not true. Usually do two things. One, we'll tweet it, and two, we'll reach out to the media organization.
And when you say tweet it, you mean that you're tweeting that they should make a correction?
We're tweeting what the issue is, what the statement or claim is in this article. And then we also reach out to the media organization. And in some cases, the media organization, a few hours later, you check back, they have changed their wording slightly so that it becomes more nuanced or objective than what it was before. If you read the news, if you go online, let's say, and something's published on Monday, you go on there Tuesday, you scroll down to the bottom, and it says an earlier version of this piece said X. It has now been changed. Sometimes that's due to honest reporters reaching out to the media organization, pointing out the issue with what they have printed and asking them to correct it. Obviously, it's an issue once if they've printed the story, but because so much of our lives are online now, you can have a real-time effect of they changed the story online, so people who read it later online won't be influenced, I guess.
And I can imagine that especially now during the war, there are probably outlets that don't love being contacted by honest reporting.
For sure, there are some journalists who don't like it when you criticize their words. But I think media organizations are more receptive than people might think to being corrected, especially if it's a factual correction that's just clearly incorrect. And so that's why honest reporting has been able to get these corrections, because the media is receptive to a certain extent to our pointing out the faults in their stories.
For an organization that is focused on making sure the media is honest when it comes to Israel, what does a win for you look like?
I think there can be different levels of wins. When the media corrects a story, that's a win. When honest reporting's work is publicized by other, let's say, more sympathetic media outlets, that's a win. As long as we're getting the narrative out there and people are receptive to it, whether in the media or just in the general public, that's all a win.
Throughout this war, honest reporting has been very active, making sure that the media is honest. What's been the biggest impact that you've had during the war?
For sure, our biggest story was the story that was done in November about the Gazan photo journalists who joined Hamas in crossing the border on October 7th. And that story keeps on repeating itself in the sense of the pictures were in yearly roundups by the newer news organizations that use them. So I'm just going to explain briefly what the story is that Honest Reporting looked into who the Gazan photo journalists were who crossed the border with Hamas on October 7th, and we asked certain questions. As much as we asked questions about these Gazan photo journalists, we also asked questions about the journalistic ethics of news organizations that use these photos, which were clearly taken from the Israeli side by photojournalists who had crossed the border and had stood alongside Hamas terrorists. And so that was our biggest story. And the impact, I would say, is twofold. One, were about these photojournalists, Hassan Slayer, who he worked for the AP and CNN. AP cut ties with him. CNN suspended their ties with him. And I would say the longer lasting impact of that story is that we've put the question in people's minds when they see news coming from photojournalists and freelancers from Gaza to ask, are they presenting the news organizations that they work for and ultimately the reading or viewing audience with an objective account of what's happening, or are they presenting them with a biased account that is solely meant to skew the way people perceive Israel's actions or Hamas's actions?
One of the other things that you specifically have been working on is a list of journalists killed during the war. And I'd love to know more from you. What do you have to say about that list?
So you're right. One of the narratives being presented in the media is the effect that the war has had on journalists in Gaza. Journalists in general, but specifically in Gaza. And if you read reports, every once in a while, it'll say, like, 90 journalists have been killed in Gaza. Without any contextual information, it looks like Israel is targeting journalists in Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists is a running list of every single journalist who's been killed during the war, including in Israel, Lebanon, and Gaza. And the majority are from Gaza. And if you look through every name, some are affiliated. They were quote-unquote journalists, but they work for Hamas's TV or radio stations or Palestinian Islamic Jihad's media channels. And for other names, we cross-reference them with a list provided by the Meir Meat Center, which focuses on intelligence and terrorism. At the time that the piece had been written, 55% of journalists killed in Gaza had either been members of a terrorist organization like Hamas or Islamic Jihad or PFLP, or they were affiliated in some way with a terrorist organization.
There's a TV show called The Newsroom that I love. And the character who plays the executive producer has a rule: no reporting about the media. Have we been spending a lot of time during this war just talking about the media itself?
So first, I too love the newsroom. I don't think we've been focusing too much on the media. To use a term that's been bandied about a lot during the war, I think the focus on the media has been proportional to the media's role. Because when I say media, I don't only mean traditional media, I mean social media also. And because so much of the focus of the world has been on what's happening in Israel Gaza since October 7th, and the media and social media have been playing a key role in what information is getting out, I don't think there's been too much focus on the media.
If someone at home is reading the news, they're watching TV, they're scrolling on social media, and they see that journalists, they're not being totally honest, what should they do?
So, one, they can reach out to the media outlet itself and respectfully explain why they disagree with what was presented, why they feel there's something incorrect in the report, and maybe they can get a correction that way. Two, they can turn to organizations like Honest Reporting and explain. We get these all the time from people saying, I saw this on the news, I think it's wrong, can you take a look at it? And then sometimes we'll say, yep, you're right, we'll reach out to the media organization. And so you can influence the media in those two ways.
And if we turn to think for a moment about Israeli society itself, how has it been impacted by the media?
I can only answer this question off a gut feeling. I haven't studied any way how the interplay between the Israeli society and the media. But I have a feeling that even before October 7th, Israelis always felt it was an uphill battle to have the media portray Israel fairly, going back to the time of Second Intifada, even before that. And I feel that since October 7th, for anyone who's looked at the way the media is portraying Israel, whether on YouTube through broadcasts or through print media, I feel like the Israelis just feel like that hill is getting larger and it's getting harder to climb in the fight against media bias when it comes to Israel.
The final question that I ask every guest is, what is giving you hope today?
I think there are two things giving me hope. One is Israeli society and Israelis in general. On October 6th, Israel was going through a deeply fractious period. There are a lot of fissures in Israeli society between different political camps, religious camps. As soon as October 7th happened, everyone kind of dropped their ideological baggage and they got together for the greater good of Israeli society. Whether it's people from the right, left, and center going into reserve units, whether it's people from the left, right, and center coming together to provide aid to those who have been affected by the Hamas's invasion on October 7th, or evacuees from the north and the south, that has given me hope. As well, Eurovision has given me hope. Because I feel like since October 7th, even the first week, by the end of the week, there's already this feeling that Israel was losing sympathy of the world and that the world was turning against Israel. And that feeling has only become stronger as the months of the war have gone on. But as we saw in Eurovision, despite the negative attention that Israel has been getting worldwide, whether it's these campus protests or it's in the media, there is still a silent majority that has not turned their backs on Israel, can appreciate Israel and Israelis, and can separate politics from Israel. And I think that is necessary going forward for Israel standing in the world. So Eurovision, in a weird way, also gives me hope.
I loved Eden Golan's song, and I love that ending to this episode. Chaim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Naomi Studios for hosting us today, and thank you to all of you for joining us. If you'd like to support the people of Israel, I recommend that you smash the subscribe button, and you can follow us on social media for more updates about the Homefront podcast. Thank you again for joining us.